In the autumn of 1023, in the bustling city of Chengdu, a merchant named Lu stood before a wooden counter stacked not with copper coins, but with folded sheets of mulberry bark paper. Outside, porters strained under strings of bronze cash, heavy, clattering loops of metal that had to be carried on bamboo poles. Inside, clerks brushed ink onto paper certificates marked with seals and signatures. Lu handed over his coins and received, in exchange, a printed note promising repayment on demand. He left the shop lighter by several dozen pounds, but not poorer. Weeks later, he would redeem that same note in another district, using it to settle accounts without moving a single coin. The transaction drew little attention at the time. Yet in that quiet exchange, ink on paper replacing metal in hand, the mechanics of global trade began to change. For centuries before Lu stepped into that shop, money had weight. Across Eurasia, commerce depended on metal, copper for daily transactions, silver for larger settlements, and gold for state treasuries and long-distance trade. In China's Song dynasty, the economy was expanding rapidly. Iron production soared. Markets spread into rural towns. Tax revenues increased. But the currency system struggled to keep pace. The empire relied heavily on copper coinage. As trade intensified, demand for coins surged. Mines could not always supply enough metal. Transporting currency across long distances was costly and dangerous. 1,000 coins strung together weighed several kilograms. Merchants moving goods between Sichuan and the Yangtze Delta required entire caravans simply to carry money. Loss through theft, shipwreck, or banditry was common. The very success of commercial growth exposed the limitations of metallic currency. Local merchants in Sichuan devised a practical solution. Rather than transporting coin, they deposited it with trusted wholesalers and received paper receipts, jiaozi, that could be redeemed later. At first, these notes circulated privately, accepted because merchants trusted the issuer's reputations and reserves. Over time, the volume of notes grew. So did their geographic reach. The Song government observed this experiment carefully. By 1024, it intervened, not to suppress the practice, but to regulate and eventually monopolize it. Official printing offices began issuing standardized notes backed by state authority. Designs included intricate patterns to deter forgery. Expiration dates limited circulation periods. Redemption rules were codified. What began as a merchant convenience became a government-managed currency instrument. The transformation was mechanical and deliberate. Coins were deposited with licensed offices. Paper notes were printed in fixed denominations. Each carried official seals and serial markings. When a note returned for redemption, it was withdrawn and destroyed. New notes were issued against stored reserves or anticipated tax revenues. The system required trust in the issuing authority and confidence that paper could reliably represent metal. Risk shifted in subtle ways. Merchants no longer bore the burden of transporting coin. Instead, the state assumed responsibility for maintaining credibility. If too many notes were printed relative to reserves, their value would erode. If redemption faltered, confidence would collapse. Paper money reduced physical friction but introduced financial discipline as a matter of policy. The innovation did not remain confined to Sichuan. As Song commercial networks expanded, through river transport, maritime trade, and urban markets, paper currency traveled with them. It simplified tax collection and military provisioning. Officials could requisition goods using notes rather than hauling bullion across provinces. Trade within the empire accelerated because settlement became lighter, faster, and more flexible. Centuries later, a similar problem confronted Europe, though under different conditions. By the 17th century, long-distance trade linked Amsterdam, London, Hamburg, and the Baltic ports. Silver flowed in from the Americas, but coinage varied widely in purity and weight. Merchants dealing in multiple currencies faced constant recalculation and risk. In 1609, the city of Amsterdam established the Wisselbank, or exchange bank. Merchants deposited mixed coins and received credit entries in bank money, a ledger-based unit of account backed by stored metal. Payments were transferred through book entries rather than physical exchange. The bank required full backing of deposits, and withdrawals were tightly regulated. For large transactions, settlement through the Wisselbank became more reliable than handling coin. Though not paper money in the modern sense, This system further detached trade from physical metal. The critical step was abstraction. Value no longer needed to move in tangible form. It could be represented, recorded, and transferred through institutional guarantees. England took the next leap amid political and fiscal strain. In 1694, facing the costs of war with France, the government chartered the Bank of England. Investors lent funds to the state in exchange for incorporation and the right to issue banknotes. These notes promised payment in specie on demand. They circulated widely because they were backed by both the bank's reserves and the credibility of the English government's tax base. The mechanism was more dynamic than earlier models. When individuals deposited gold or silver, the bank issued notes. But it also extended loans, creating additional notes against creditworthy borrowers. Paper currency thus expanded beyond the metal physically stored in vaults. Convertibility into gold anchored confidence, yet day-to-day trade relied increasingly on paper. This flexibility proved powerful. The British state could finance military campaigns without waiting to accumulate bullion. Merchants could settle accounts across the Atlantic through bills and notes rather than chests of coin. London emerged as a financial center not because it possessed the most gold, but because it possessed institutions capable of mobilizing credit efficiently. Across the 18th and 19th centuries, paper money accompanied imperial expansion. The French assignats during the Revolution demonstrated both the potential and peril of excessive issuance. The American colonies experimented with bills of credit. In each case, the success of paper currency depended less on ink and fiber than on governance, tax systems, enforcement capacity, and restraint. By the mid-19th century, central banks in Europe standardized note issuance under gold convertibility. A merchant in Manchester could accept a banknote confident it represented a defined quantity of gold. International trade operated through a network of gold-backed currencies linked by exchange rates. Settlement between nations still required gold flows, but domestic commerce relied largely on paper. The shift altered the geography of power. Countries with stable banking systems could expand trade beyond the limits of their mines. Capital could circulate through credit instruments, funding railways, factories, and steamships. Financial centers, London, Paris, later New York, became nodes through which paper claims directed real resources. The 20th century loosened the final tie. During World War I, many governments suspended gold convertibility to finance military expenditures. After a turbulent interwar period and the Bretton Woods arrangement linking currencies to the US dollar, convertibility to gold ended definitively in 1971. Paper money became fiat currency, valued not for redemption in metal, but for its acceptance and payment of taxes and its management by central banks. The machine had evolved. Instead of coins stored in vaults, modern central banks manage balance sheets composed of government bonds and other assets. Commercial banks create deposits through lending, constrained by regulation and reserve requirements. Digital entries now dominate over physical notes. Yet the underlying architecture remains recognizable. Representation of value by trusted institutions, circulation based on confidence, and expansion limited by policy credibility. Paper money reshaped global trade because it reduced friction. It lowered transportation costs. It enabled large-scale credit. It allowed governments to mobilize resources quickly. It shifted constraints from the availability of metal to the management of trust. In Song China, the state could provision frontier armies without shipping tons of coin. In 18th century Britain, naval fleets were supplied through credit networks that spanned oceans. In the industrial age, railways were financed through bonds and banknotes that represented future revenue rather than mined gold. Each expansion of trade rested on increasingly abstract forms of payment. What endured was not the specific material, mulberry bark, cotton fiber, polymer, but the institutional principle. Money became a system of recorded claims rather than a commodity in itself. Its reliability depended on accounting, law, and governance. Its scale depended on confidence that paper promises would be honored. Today's electronic transfers, settled in milliseconds across continents, carry the DNA of those early notes in Chengdu. They rely on central authorities, standardized units of account, and the expectation that balances can be redeemed for goods, services, or tax payments. The physical burden has vanished. The institutional burden remains. On a shelf in a museum in Sichuan rests a fragment of early jiaozi, faded ink on brittle paper, its characters partially worn away. It once stood in for heavy strings of copper coins, passed between merchants along crowded streets. The paper is thin. The idea it carried proved enduring. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe. History has the answers. I'll show you where to look.